there. Good evening, everyone. This is Dari on World Streams Radio. Thank you for joining us tonight. To learn more about World Streams Radio, visit our website at www.worldstreams.org. Tonight our guest is Jamie D. Allen, bead researcher, historian, lecturer, and author. Jamie has been involved in the study of beads for over 30 years. He is the author of numerous publications and books, co-founder of the Society of Bead Researchers, and was recently co-chair of a seminar for the International Bead and Beadwork Conference in Istanbul, Turkey. You might be saying to yourself, why beads? Well, beads represent the oldest form of art. They were the first durable ornaments coveted by mankind not only for their beauty, but also for their supposed magical and talismanic properties. And they were also used as currency in many parts of the world. Now I'd like to introduce you to our host, Saeed. Hi there, Saeed.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here tonight in our virtual auditorium. Tonight we are going to speak with Jamie Allen. Hello, Jamie. How are you?
I'm very good, Saeed. How are you?
Very well. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight with us. As Dari has introduced the subject of beads, quite frankly, I had the same questions. Why beads? How would you answer that question? Everybody is definitely skeptical about this topic, but while researching it for this interview, I was very, very, very interested in all the findings about the relationship between beads and the origins of modern human behavior and so many things. So would you please tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll have many questions for you.
The topic of beads is interesting because beads encompass a pursuit that is worldwide in its expression and goes back as far as we can tell humanity goes back. And it's something that is common in our everyday lives and that we take for granted, and consequently people don't think much about it.
Correct.
And therefore it is a study that has gone largely ignored until about sometime in the past, say, 40 years. I entered into it a little more than 30 years ago, so I'm still considered an early pioneer, but there were people who were interested in beads before me. And beads are kind of fundamental to understanding some of the details and intricacies of culture from archaeological perspectives as well. So archaeologists were the first people to become interested in beads.
Okay, why don't we start with the definition of beads, and then we can go from there and really explain to our listeners and also our Pal Talk audience what this is all about. Let's define what is a bead.
Well, that is a very good starting place in point of fact, and it's easy to define, but it doesn't encompass all manifestations of beads.
Right.
Essentially, beads are concerned with human personal adornment. And the bead is the fundamental element in doing an adornment for the body. A bead is any perforated object that is strung by itself or with others on fibers to create constructions that adorn the body. And you can either begin by making a bead, or you can take something that already exists and you can adapt it to becoming a bead. Probably the first beads that mankind exploited that still persist in the archaeological record are mollusk shells from easily 30,000 years ago, but right now we speculate maybe as long ago as 90,000 years ago.
Yeah, are you referring to the Nassarius shells?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, please.
So as soon as you take a shell, a seashell, or any object, and you perforate it, it becomes a bead. And it becomes, when you put it onto your body, an article of personal adornment. But that's also a simplistic way of looking at it, because from the very beginning we suspect, by thinking backwards in time and deconstructing, that from the very beginning beads were more important than just being ornamental, that they are tangible evidence of abstract thinking and of symbolism.
Right. Okay, let's talk about the materials.
Well, as a bead researcher, I divide beads by their material into 5 primary groups.
Okay.
And the earliest and most enduring group in terms of popularity and worldwide expression is organic materials, such as shells, coral, pearls, amber, and of course there are others, but those are the primary ones. And then beyond that, minerals were very important from as early as 5000 BC, but especially after 3000 BC.
I grew up in a culture that gave a lot of importance to corals, but continue, please.
Oh, yes. Well, coral happens to be my favorite material of all of them, followed by amber and glass. Okay. After minerals, of course, come metals. Somewhere in there is ceramics, although ceramics have never really been terribly important bead materials, with the exception of certain expressions. In China, they like ceramics a lot, but
is it because
did not.
Because of the technology required for heating the material and all that?
Well, I think they were just very adept at doing it, and they made every possible construction out of ceramics that they could. The Chinese were not interested in glass per se until very late in their history. So all of the things that we make that we consider to be perfunctory in our daily lives that would be made out of glass, they made out of ceramics and out of metals.
You put them in five major groups, correct?
Yes, and we've already discussed organics, minerals, metals.
Right.
Glass is probably the single most important material from which beads are made since its introduction about 3,500 years ago, plus or minus some number of centuries. And then synthetics. Synthetics have become very important from the mid to late 19th century through the 20th century. So 150 years ago, there were very few synthetic materials around, but now we have literally hundreds of them.
I think we will. I'd like to ask you to maybe give us a little, expand a little bit on these groups that you have, and then maybe what historical impact each one of them has on our cultural understanding of beads.
Well, all these things happen in waves and with elements of faddism. There are always fads for things, and things come to prominence. I don't even know if we can talk about how it happens, but sometimes it's technological achievement. For instance, the development of glass changed everybody's daily life in profound ways. But it was a natural material, not natural in the sense of being naturally made, but appropriate for being exploited to do personal adornment, probably earlier than for any other function that you can think of. But prior to the invention of glass, from at least 5,000 years ago, the forerunner of glass, a material that we call faience, was the first artificial material that was devised. And it actually is made from the same components as glass, but not with much less a homogeneous fusion. And that remains important even today in certain parts of the world.
Wow.
So I think when the technology allows you to exploit a material, then the material becomes important.
But that also, doesn't that also create a problem between authenticity of a material and something that is synthetically created?
Well, yes, there are problems in that region. One of the most important issues I deal with as a bead researcher is always trying to discern whether something is real, authentic, or imitation, or synthetic, or simulant. And the plain fact is that as early as 2500 BC, people who were in charge of bead making were constantly trying to find new, better, faster, cheaper ways of making something that looked like the same product that had become desirable in their region.
Right.
And so we have 5,000 years worth of imitations and imitations of imitations and substitutes of imitations of imitations. It's a never-ending cacophony of trying to do interpretation.
Chevron beads, how are they made?
Well, essentially what they have to do is they make a primary glass construction, which is called a cane. And a cane in Venetian parlance, cana, is any cylindrical construction that is hollow or solid, and for making cane beads, it must be a hollow cane.
Wow. What about the difference between fire-polished beads and furnace glass beads, for example? What is the difference there?
Well, a furnace glass bead is any bead that's actually made at a furnace. And it doesn't tell you much about the bead to use that name because there are different kinds of furnace beads. Glass bead making divides into 7 primary different types of constructions, and they are either wound. A wound bead is probably the earliest glass beads that were made in any number by artisans who did production of any kind. Probably made wound beads, and that's basically withdrawing a strand of glass from a crucible and wrapping it around an iron rod that is now called a mandrel, much the way you would put thread onto a spool. So it's wrapped around many, many times, and then the bead is knocked off the mandrel and has a perforation automatically. So that's one of the primary ways. Once they had figured out that they needed to make beads much faster than that, then they developed the cane method, which I was just describing a few moments ago, where they first made a long, hollow tube of glass, and then they take that tube and they break it into segments, and each segment then becomes a bead.
Jamie, let me ask you this. What is the difference between different parts of the world as far as how they refer to their beads? For example, Millefiori and African Kifa beads and Ghanan and so forth. Can you walk us through the difference between all these types of beads?
Well, we have to remember at all times that one of the fundamental prospects with beads is that they are very transportable. And in many places in the world, a local industry develops for the express purpose of making beads to send elsewhere. And this has been going on since the Phoenicians made glass beads in Phocaea in Asia Minor, their home, and in Carthage in North Africa, and they traded them as far away as the British Isles in the west, Scandinavia in the north, and China to the east. And so the trade in beads has always been really very important. So in looking at beads, trying to get the big picture of them, one of the first things we always have to try and determine is whether any particular bead is a local bead or an imported bead. And local beads are the beads that people make primarily for their own use or the use within their community and their region. And trade beads or beads that come from abroad are exotic things that people find interesting because they're so different from what they have as local expressions. So you mentioned Kifa beads. Kifa beads are very beautiful and very collectible beads that were made in the early 20th century down to reasonably recent times and have experienced a wave of new production in the last maybe 10 years. But they're primarily made by Mauritanian women under very primitive circumstances and basically for their own use. But what instigated the manufacture of these beads for them was the ancient beads that used to come to them from the Middle East during the Islamic period, so say about 1,000 years ago to about 500 years ago, followed by the trade beads that came to them from from Europe during the Age of Exploration and into modern times. They liked all of these glass beads, but the ancient ones especially were, being much older and rarer, much less available to them and very expensive if they could be found. So Mauritanian women turned to making their own beads. And what they would do is they would acquire European glass beads that were not expensive because they were monochromatic and simply made, sometimes mass-produced and molded. And they would grind them down to powder. And for red glass, they would grind up red beads. And for blue glass, blue beads, yellow glass, yellow beads. And they would combine these pastes that they would make to make multicolored beads that were unique to their region.
Oh, okay. Well, we have Dari here has just joined us also, and we know that Dari is definitely an avid collector of beads, and I'll have her ask you a few questions here. Also questions from our audience. Go ahead, Dari.
We have many Moroccans listening tonight, Jamie. Can you speak of beads that are native to Morocco? Are there any special types of beads that one can find in that country or specific areas of Morocco? We were speaking of Amazonite and amber the other night.
Well, Morocco is a very important nexus because of its location in the extreme northwest of Africa, and being an entrepot for products from many parts of the world, but especially Europe. And so for many generations, great trade goods have been coming into Morocco and are used by Berber and other native people for self-expression that is unique to the region, even though the materials come from elsewhere. An interesting combination of the local use of exotic materials from elsewhere and native-made products from there. The expression of them is unique in that they have color preferences, size and shape preferences, and they have extraordinary craftsmen who make wonderful things.
So what makes, if you pick up a bead, what would tell you, hey, this is Moroccan, or hey, this is Japanese, or this is Chinese?
Well, the beads that I think of as being most distinctly Moroccan are silver beads with enamel decoration on them, and because individually crafted by hand, based on an evolutionary trend and a tradition of working silver and ornamenting it and enameling it. They make beads that then are unique to that region. And even though many other people in the world make silver beads and many people enamel their silver beads, you would never mistake an Afghan enameled silver bead for a Moroccan silver bead. They're just totally different animals.
And aren't these manufactured or handmade down around in the south of Morocco, around the Tiznit area, maybe?
Tiznit is supposed to be a very important place of bead manufacture, yes. Unfortunately, I haven't been to Morocco myself, so...
Jamie, this brings me to another question. What countries did you travel to for your research and in your quest for beads?
Well, I traveled to Europe a lot to pursue research into historical trade beads of the last 500 years, and I have spent most of my time at Venice and in Amsterdam because those are the big important centers of traditional glassworking in Europe, and to a lesser degree England. I like England very much, and England is a wonderful repository of ornaments from all over the world, simply because, you know, the English commandeered so much of the world 100 years ago and traveled everywhere. But I've also been to China and Asia, and I've been twice to Africa, West Africa. And I'm preparing right now to make a trip this fall to Indonesia to study Javanese glass beads, which I'm very excited about.
What about Timbuktu?
Timbuktu is part of the greater Niger River urban complex that existed about nearly 1,000 years ago. And well, mostly the Niger River is largely in Mali, where these urban centers were. Timbuktu and Djenné are the places that provide us with medieval beads from that time that are a combination of beads probably from the Middle East, Egypt, and to a much lesser extent and later in time, early beads from Europe.
Do you think that if we, because I've heard these words being used before, Venetian, Bohemian, Russian, African, what is the distinction between these types of beads?
Well, there's a lot of confusion in the bead world about these things. For instance, you mentioned the Russian bead, and there is a specific family of glass beads that are all called Russian beads, and people think that that means that they were made in Russia, by Russians, for Russians, or from Russians, however you want to interpret that word, but it's really a contextual problem. The name comes from the fact that when the Russians were involved in Alaska and the northwest coast of North America, in the fur trade, they knew that in order to deal with native people in North America, that one of the important trade goods they would have to have would be beads. And at that time, they were getting beads from China that had come to China from Bohemia. And now, historically, we call them Russian beads because we believe that they were traded to native people by the Russians. But the beads actually themselves were made and manufactured and exported out of Bohemia. And also it happened later in time than most people think. Most people think that these beads are like 150 years old, whereas they're really only about 90 to 100 years old.
Well, Dari, do you have any questions from our audience?
Yes. There are some people that are beginning collectors, and they'd like to know what they can watch out for if they're buying beads that are in the 100-year-old range, for instance, like maybe Venetian Millefioris or older 100-year-old type beads from Czech Bohemia.
The important thing in this day and age, with the situation that we're in the world, is as much as there was incredible exportation of beads around the world beginning 500 years ago, it is now phenomenal. And all beads travel everywhere as fast as airplanes can take them. So consequently, even though the most recent beads that were produced in the last 100 years or so are also the most plentiful, they are now beginning to become a little more scarce because of the collecting that's happened for the last 30 years. But now the Chinese, and to an important extent the Indians, have come into the marketplace with their new reproductions of antique trade beads that are now routinely sold as the real thing.
Right, and some of them look very, very close to the older ones, but if you really study the patterns and the colors, I think, as you said before, you can see the difference, even in photos if you're looking at them.
The Chinese, though, have come a long way in about 10 years' time, and each year their beads are more realistic than the year before. So, for instance, the chevron bead being one of the most important glass beads. They've only been making chevron beads for about 6 years now, and until last year you could spot a Chinese chevron bead on site because they were different enough in the color and the patterns and the size and the way the bead is made and finished. But last year they reached critical mass, and now they make chevron beads that are virtually, visibly indistinguishable from Venetian beads. And next year they will be indistinguishable.
These beads were at a given time used as currency also, right?
Well, I think that that's really greatly overstressed in our history. If you were a numismatist who actually studied the details of money and gave it a tight definition, then beads would very seldom fit into it. Beads are certainly a store of wealth for any culture, but that doesn't make them currency. And your net worth as a resourceful individual, but a store of wealth means that you have invested something into acquiring the beads, and in times of need, you can sell the beads and get whatever that is back. You can get goods or furnishings or education.
Trade them for something.
Anything that you can trade them for, yes.
And that's where the trade bead name came from then? That's why some of them are referred to as trade beads, right?
It is, although, I really think that the term export bead is really rather more meaningful especially in the economy that we have over the last 100 years, where virtually every place in the world now has its own currency.
Well, Jamie, we really thank you for being with us tonight. And thanks also to Dari, and thanks to our listeners for joining us again tonight. And visit our website, worldstreams.org, for more details of upcoming programs, to listen to some of the most exotic music on earth. Thanks again, Jamie, for being with us tonight.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Bye, Jamie. Thank you.
Thanks, Dari.